We'll welcome our friend, Alison, back up. She's going to continue the conversation from this morning, and we'll go ahead and get started. And we will be using our school-wide center-wide document for this portion of our agenda. So in your spiral-bound essentials document, it's the one that's second. You can go ahead and find that while we're getting set up here.
All right. We have one more hour together here, or I guess 45 minutes. We'll see what we can do. And we're going to dive into the school-wide and center-wide in a moment, the organizational practices. But again, we're going to bring everything we've been talking about to our understanding of this document because, as I hope you're realizing, how we think about this document is going to matter. You've probably in your career seen a lot of documents somewhat like this in some form or another. It's like any other document that how we read it and how we actually enact it is what matters. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper. So I'm hoping today we dig into it a little bit, just a little bit, and give you a sense of how you might read it going forward and how you might engage your colleagues in thinking about it so that it doesn't just become another document. Just like we don't want the math essentials to just become another document. So we just dove into these thinking traps. We want to bring those forward. And over lunch, I was talking with Maisie, and we realized there's another place where we fall into this trap as systems. I'm just going to name it so that we think about not doing it. Here's not a trap. Here's not an answer right now. Please do not think, oh, the answer is let's have Maisie come for an hour. We are all guilty of that. Okay? Please also don't say, oh, we'll have Alison come and do this same sequence and then check, we'll be done. None of that actually is going to be the answer. So those are examples of how we go to something that feels useful and then we think, oh, if just everyone else experiences that, then we'll all change. But that's not the way it works. Okay, so there's an example of where we fall into that trap all the time. What we're going to be thinking about a little bit today is the learning demands for leaders in your system. So we want to bring forward these design principles as we think about leader learning in order to actually change our systems. And again, I just want this to be center in our heads. How are we creating different storylines? These organizational practices can be used to create the same storylines, or they can be used to create new storylines. Okay. Again, everything we do sends a message. With that, this is another document that we're putting forth as a tool to hopefully support your work. As Rusty said, there's been a literacy version for a while. With this math work launching, it was an opportunity to revise the initial literacy one, and what you'll see is we brought math and literacy together. That's potentially powerful. I've used potentially very intentionally here, in that it might support leaders to think across content areas where we know pre-K3 teachers are teaching both. So if we can support both in similar ways, that's going to be much more powerful. I know a lot of you haven't even had a chance to really look at it yet, so I am going to give you a few minutes right now, and here's what I want you to focus on. We're going to dive deeper in a minute. I want you to read the guiding core values again, and just orient yourself. What are the big headline practices? So take a moment to just orient yourself to this document. We're switching gears a little bit to a new document, so take a moment to orient yourself. Okay. What we're going to do now is practice bringing everything we've thought about the last day and a half, our conception of learning, to our interpretation of the document. So again, we could all read this and come away with very different ideas. How do we start bringing a new shared idea of what we want to support and what it's going to take to our reading of a document? How do we bring these ideas we've been working on through the last day and a half to our interpretation of this document? Because what we can do, which is very human to do, is to set it aside and read it with our existing assumptions, right? How do we read it differently? So let's practice together. We're going to bring forward these ideas that we worked on that are on our posters around the room. And we're going to do that through two different ways. I'm going to do some more thinking traps with you, and then we're also going to think about goals for leader learning. Again, these thinking traps are the habitual ways we fall into doing things. They're the ways we end up thinking about things without even meaning to, because it's just the script we've learned about how to do our roles. It's just the way the system works, so we just do it. It's the recipe that we follow without meaning to. So here's a thinking trap we fall into when we try to make organizational and systems level change. Actually, I'm going to revise how I say that. This is a trap we fall into when we're trying to make a more specific change, like math instructional change, or literacy instructional change, or we're trying to change the role of the principal, right? We don't consider the broader context and the systems that that piece is inside of. Okay, so it's similar to the trap that I brought forward from earlier of thinking if we just deliver something and plug the hole, right, then everything will work well. So in your groups, I want you to look through. This is a trap that we could fall into as we read this document and as we try to implement the math essentials. We could just focus on math. We tried to, in revising this document, make some nods towards not doing that, but any one of us could read this document and fall right into that trap because it's in our head. So look through the document together and say, where do we see intentional effort to avoid this thinking trap, right? And maybe where are some places we could fall into it that we need to mark so that we don't fall into it? Does that make sense? So where do we see emphasis on considering the whole system versus just piecemeal implementation of new ideas or systems? Take a look.
Saying that it takes time, requires ongoing increased revision, and is never done. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pause your conversations. So that was the first thinking trap we could fall into as we try to read this document and make sense of it and implement it in our context, right? Here's another one. There's different, just like there's different conceptualizations of learning, there's different conceptions of equity. And often the predominant one in our context can be that we just need to make test scores similar. Or even more explicitly, that black and brown kids need to have the same test scores as white kids, which there's a lot of problems with that. That's a thinking trap we can fall into. And it's connected to these other thinking traps that we talked about earlier. The educational context has shifted a lot since the first version of this document. This was a focus of the revision, or an attempted focus of the revision, to remove some deficit perspective that was in the document, to remove some emphasis on test scores that was in the document. But it's a trap we can fall into. So here's what I want you to look for. Where do you see an emphasis on conceptualizing equity in relation to these ideas instead? And I would say it's imperfect. We probably missed some spots, or there's some spots where it's not as explicit as it could be. So also note where you do not see it, or where could we fall into the trap of focusing on test scores rather than on the experiences kids have and how they feel seen and valued in their spaces, and how their communities and families are viewed. So take a look and see what you see in the document.
That they don't have their networks already.
Hey, I'm going to pause your conversation again. I know it's hard to stop talking about this one, but I'm hoping I can bring you back. Is my mic on? I think maybe it's on. All right, I'm going to bring you back, please. Okay. I can tell this one maybe felt a little extra juicy and challenging. I want to name, the point of naming these thinking traps is to name these are things that are alive in our systems. They are alive in our systems, and we need to think critically about them and decide if they align with the goals we're saying we have. And I'm also going to acknowledge that it's a challenge in our individual roles to think about tackling some of these bigger things that exist around us in our systems. But hopefully you're seeing that some of these thinking traps provide powerful lenses for us to catch ourselves and notice where it's shaping our thinking as we read new documents or design something for our schools or systems, or even just the words we say in one interaction. These thinking traps shape that. Okay, another thinking trap which we talked about earlier, but I want to highlight here because if you haven't been able to tell, this is a big thing for me, and I was one of the people revising this document, and you might be able to see where I said we need to put this in. Okay? I want you to look through and think about, where do you see an intentional effort to emphasize that adults have to learn too? At every single role, adults have to learn too. And this idea that just because I've been something doesn't mean I then know how to support someone else to do it. Those are very different things. So there's places we tried to put it in. See if you can see them. There's also places where we probably didn't put it in where it should be. See if you can notice that. Where could you fall into this trap without meaning to? Okay? Take a look at the document through this lens now.
Forced to go out and start teaching. I was like, okay, doing it. Follow this activity.
Okay, I'm going to pause your conversations again. All right. I want to call out my favorite thing I've heard as I've walked around a little bit is folks noticing where we didn't put something that's important. Please notice those things and add them in. This is an incomplete document. And I love that people are starting to notice, like someone said, well, what about the role of leaders in professional learning? That's not quite here yet, right? Those are things that are not there that we have to bring our ideas about what learning is and how it needs to be supported to rethink everything. This is just one set of ideas about what we can do. It's missing a lot of stuff. So we need to bring our ideas about what to add. And to that point, we're going to move now to thinking about what does this mean for leader learning, including ourselves. And this means thinking about our own learning and our leaders' learning in our system through this same lens. If kids are going to see themselves differently and do new things and know new things, then teachers need to, and everyone leading teachers need to also. So here's what we're going to do. I want us to zoom in on organizational practice 4. And that's because this is the one about professional learning, and we've been talking a lot about learning. Here's how we can read any of these practices. We can read it as a list of things to do. And then what we do is we bring what we kind of assume each one means, and we try to do it, right? Instead, what I want us to kind of shift our lens a little bit, what if we read this as looking for what the learning demands are? What do leaders need to learn in order to bring this organizational practice to life in a way that will support the math essentials in the way we're hoping they come to life? Okay, so in your groups, you're going to zoom in on organizational practice 4, but I want you to bring everything else we know, right? I just said things are missing here. So bring everything else you know, too, from the last 2 days to think about what do our leaders need to learn if we're going to develop really powerful professional learning in our context. And we're going to make one last poster, the last one, thinking about the knowing, doing, and becoming that's going to be required for ourselves and other leaders in our system if professional learning is actually going to be as powerful as we need it to be for our kids' experiences to change. Any questions about the task? Okay, we're going to take 10 minutes on this. It's an example of a way you can engage with this document that's not what do we do, but what do we need to learn. Let's try it out.
Like forced to go out and start teaching. I was like, okay, doing it. Follow this activity. Next is it, I would just try with kids and I would do it. Not really, I probably wasn't asking the right questions. I wasn't doing it. But I was doing it, right? And then over time, like having continuing those conversations with my peers and going back and revisiting those activities, doing them again, maybe with another group, later, like then I started seeing, oh, this is why I'm having them
Okay, I'm gonna pause your deep conversations here. Again, that was a taste of what happens when we look at this document with the lens of what learning is embedded in this? What do we need to support people to learn versus a checklist of what we need to do? Those are two really different lenses to bring to how you read a document. And I'm hoping you see that that's an important lens to bring to both of the documents we've been looking at the last 2 days. The essential practices for math can also be read as a to-do list of what to do, right? Or we can look at them through the lens of what do we need to support people to learn? What's the complexity of learning that's involved in this for it to actually come to life? So we've worked on 4 little posters, little tastes of trying out some different lenses the last 2 days. What I'm hoping you're starting to see is how these help us think and talk differently and imagine differently about the work that we have to do, the really hard, complex work we have to do. So I think what I've put up here are ways to continue each of these activities. So if we think about the poster we made for assumptions about kids and how we want kids to see themselves, do it again. Think about it for teachers and leaders, or maybe think across your system. How do we want any learner to be seen, and how do we want any learner to feel about themselves or see themselves as a powerful next conversation to have? Okay? If we move down to the teacher learning goals, which was our second poster, you just focused in on one essential practice. Try some of the other ones, right? What does that help you see about an essential practice if you're looking at it through the lens of what do my teachers need to learn versus what do my teachers need to do, right? And what happens when we start to see it through the lens of becoming also? Who do we need to support our teachers over time to become? Same things for these two. So this what supports learning poster, think about where you see those ideas or not in the math essentials or in this document. Some of them might not be there, right? How do you bring them in anyways if you believe in them? And then we just looked at leader learning goals in relation to essential practice 4 from the organizational practices. What happens when you do that same activity with some of the other organizational practices or even with the math essentials? What happens if you look at a math essential with the lens of what do leaders need to learn to support this? That's more than just content knowledge. Because here's one of the mistakes we've made over the many decades of trying to change math. Most of the papers about, or research say about principals and math instructional change are about what content knowledge do principals need to have? Now that's definitely part of the puzzle. But what I'm hoping you're seeing is that's just one piece of the puzzle, and if we don't think about the other learning that our principals need to do, or the learning that our district leaders need to do, that's beyond just understanding math content, then our math classrooms aren't going to change. My other push for you is that these ideas are nice to talk about, but then don't really get into our practice. So I think together, teams I've worked with have found it really useful to make some tools out of these different exercises that they refer to a lot. Maybe it's a common document that you keep coming back to. Maybe it's a poster in a team room that you have. Maybe it's something that you make sure to weave into any meetings you have. There's different ways to think about it, right? But thinking about what are the traps that we keep falling into, how can we make sure to not fall into those traps because we're on our own learning trajectories also. And we probably haven't internalized a lot of these ideas yet either. We're starting to talk about them and think about them, but they're not at internalization, all of them necessarily for all of us. So I would really encourage you to think about what are the things we can keep talking about here, and then crucially, how do we move from not just talking about it to actually bringing it into as tools that we use in our practice to envision and imagine new ways of doing our work. Okay? Same with these principles. How can we build this into our learning? How do we make sure we have tools? How do we make sure we have routines? How do we make sure we have events that allow us to keep learning so that we can keep learning how to better support our people? Okay, so my big point, if I were to summarize the 4 different times I've gotten to think with you, is that we have to look at any educational change effort with the lens of what do I need to support people to learn? And that how we define learning when we ask that question really matters. If we mean what knowledge do I need people to have, or what test score do I need people to have, right? Or what technical skill do I want them to show me when I walk into the classroom, or what thing do I want written on their whiteboard? That's one way of thinking about learning. But if we think about learning in this more expansive, powerful way of how we need to see ourselves, what we need to know, and what we need to be able to do, then it changes how we see either of these documents. Okay? So this is just where I'm going to end. I'm really excited about the potential here. We have amazing, amazing power in this room to actually change some of our systems, but it's going to take us unlearning and relearning together and taking some risks. Because our system is set up to create the same thing that it's always created. That's the way it's set up. Okay. Thank you for thinking with me. I'll be around this afternoon if there's any questions or you want to chat further. It's been a real pleasure.